And then I imagine folks will be trickling in here, but we'll go ahead and get started. Keep this on task. That's all right. All righty. So welcome, everyone. If you don't know me, I'm Kayleen Campbell, the lighting designer in Portland at DLR Group. And if you could take a moment to mute yourself and turn your camera off so we make sure that we have enough juices for Emma to do her thing sitting in London, that'd be great. We are so glad that you're here for this conversation. So a little bit about me, I'm 50. And I've been in perimenopause for about 10 years. And my experience, like many women, is that our physicians have zero idea what they are doing using 20-year-old data. Our communities, even our female communities, seem to be afraid of questions or even talking about this stage of life. And I searched and searched and searched, trying to find any data and any help. And I came across an amazing network of women in England, initially through what's called the Balance app. So obviously, our paths are very different in terms of how we experience and manage this transition time in our lives. But I really believe that facilitating conversations with other women, we can help each other and support each other and look out for each other in this super funky time. So I would like to introduce you to my new friend, Emma Thomas. Let me tell you a little bit about her. She is a badass. She is a workplace menopause consultant and a speaker who is helping colleagues, friends thrive in midlife and menopause transition. And she has a huge amount of services that I would definitely encourage you to access. So here's a little list. She does demystifying menopause sessions to raise awareness and understanding, small group training, provides help with menopause guidelines and policies and support processes. Now, England is a little bit further along than we are with that, but I think that could be really interesting. She does sessions on managing the midlife collision, coaching for senior leaders, group coaching called Your Power Decade, and then some thought-provoking sessions on gendered ageism in the workplace, which I think a lot of us are very aware too. She is a coach. She is a Lean Six Sigma Green Belt, professional Scrum Master, and if that's not enough to keep her busy, in January 21, she launched Middling Along podcast to tell the stories of women in the middle bit of life, doing interesting stuff that they love. So thriving, not just surviving through our second adolescence. So please take a minute, find her on LinkedIn and subscribe to her podcast, Middling Along. So we will have a little, I think, time at the end if there's some questions that come up. If you would rather just write one to me personally, that's fine. If you don't want to put it in the main chat, and we'll see how much time we have at the end. But without further ado, I present to you Emma Thomas.
Thank you so much for that great introduction. And thank you, Wild, for inviting me to come talk to you about this very important topic, which of course is very dear to my heart. Yeah, as we go through, if you have any questions, please drop them in the chat. We should have time. I don't necessarily have to kind of disappear like a Cinderella at the top of the hour. So I'm very happy to hang around if people have questions. I will share my contact details as well right at the end. So if you want to drop me an email, find out a bit more, please do so. And let me see if I can. Okay, so this is me. The website for Managing the Menopause is just managingthemenopause.com, and the podcast is at middlingalong.com. You can find us there, or you can go search your podcast platform of choice and just search on Middling Along. We've got over 80 episodes there now, not solely on menopause, but yes. There's a lot of menopause content there.
Sounds good.
Great,
thanks.
Here's somebody who's muted. If you wouldn't mind just popping yourself on mute, that would be great. Thank you. So yeah, I've been running Managing the Menopause for about 18 months here. And as Kayleen quite rightly said, the conversation around menopause in the UK has come on huge amounts in the last 2-3 years. We still have a lot of work to do, but hopefully can share sort of some of our learnings. And I'm going to talk a little bit as part of the presentation about some of the things that have been happening over there in the US. So I think, that conversation there is definitely starting to heat up if you're Pardon the pun. Okay, so this session is for you if you think you might be experiencing symptoms, you know you are, and you're wondering what to do about that. You're curious, why is everyone suddenly talking about this menopause thing? Or maybe you just have someone on your team or a friend or a family member you want to support, you want to be a better, more prepared manager if you're managing a team. So we're going to cover some of the basics, kind of menopause 101. We're going to look at symptoms. We're going to look at symptom management. And then we're going to dive a little bit into why this matters in the workplace. Why are we talking about it? Why should we be talking about it more? And then signpost some sources of support and further information for you if you want to take that forward. First of all, though, I want to introduce you to these two lovely people. This is my mum and dad in their 70s. So my mum is now 75. She had a full hysterectomy in her mid-40s as a result of endometriosis, and unfortunately now has very advanced early onset Alzheimer's, osteoporosis, arthritis, high blood pressure, and a litany of chronic illnesses. And the more that I learn about menopause as a transition, the more that it has become very clear to me that we need to be very kind of proactive and look at this as a sort of a window of opportunity and an invitation to invest in ourselves and our health and make some proactive changes. So we'll talk about that a little bit later on. So some very basic definitions, if you're not yet familiar with them, apologies if I'm telling you stuff that you already know, but you may have heard the word perimenopause. We're using that terminology a lot more now. It's been around forever, but people weren't necessarily using it. So perimenopause is the period of time leading up to menopause, also called the menopause transition. And symptoms may be experienced for as little as a few months, or at the other end of the spectrum, maybe 10 years. The average is somewhere in the sort of 4 to 7 year range. Menopause itself is technically just one day when it's been 12 months since the last menstrual period. And then post-menopause is any time after that one day, and symptoms can still be experienced in that phase. And with a longer life expectancy now, many of us will be living actually half of our adult lives in a post-menopausal state. So it's really important that we prioritize that healthy aging that I touched on briefly, and sort of using this as a springboard to review areas of our life and sort of prioritizing our well-being. So when we talk about menopause in the news, in the media, a lot of the time what is really meant is perimenopause. So it's that period of time when symptoms begin and can actually be at their most pronounced. And it's likely that we're getting regular periods too, especially in the earlier stages. I think, would you mind putting yourself on mute? I think there's somebody who's not on mute. If I can just ask you to mute yourself. Thank you. So one of the things that we commonly hear is somebody say, or maybe even have said to them, I can't be perimenopausal, I'm too young. So when does it start? Well, the average age can vary across countries and ethnicities, but in the US, as in here in the UK, the average age is 51. However, 1 in 20 will naturally go through their menopause early, between the ages of 40 and 45. And that's not an insubstantial number. So if you kind of work back and think that that transition time leading up to menopause could be 10 years, it's really important that we educate ourselves as early as our 30s so that we know what to look out for. And I call it kind of joining the dots, understanding our normal, and then what's, when things change, we know what to look out for, and we can kind of put 2 and 2 together and get 4. And then another around sort of 1 or 2 in every 100 will actually enter menopause under the age of 40 years old. We call that premature ovarian insufficiency, or POI for short. And in around 80% of cases, there's no discernible underlying cause. Sometimes it's linked to genetics, but a lot of the time we just don't know why this happens. And then around 1 in every 1,000 will actually go into menopause under the age of 30 years old. It's possible to go straight into early menopause from teenagehood. It's very rare, but it does happen. And that early menopause can also be brought on by a hysterectomy, removal of the ovaries, or certain types of cancer treatment. And we know that with early onset menopause, that is indicated with higher risk, for example, of developing coronary heart disease over a lifetime compared to those who didn't go through premature menopause. If you're interested, there's been a large scale study in the USA called the SWAN study. That's swanstudy.org, and that has looked, amongst other things, at racial differences in how people experience menopause. So typically, Black women start menopause 8.5 months earlier than white women, and their symptoms last for 3.5 years longer. They're also more likely to experience hot flashes, but a lot less likely, certainly here in the UK, to take menopause hormone therapy. Hispanic women reported more hot flashes and for longer durations. And there's also a lot of interesting research going on now into the impact of trauma, including adverse childhood experiences on severity of menopause symptoms. So there's a lot more research generally going on. So here are just a few faces, your side of the Atlantic, that you might recognize. Women who have certainly in the last year, been a lot more vocal about menopause symptoms and their own experiences, or kind of campaigning for greater awareness. And you may know that Halle Berry was joined by some female senators announcing the Advancing Menopause Care and Midlife Women's Health Act. So looking for substantial funding, I think $275 million for menopause research. So fingers crossed that is going to happen. Something else that we commonly hear from people is that they think they can't be perimenopausal because they're still getting periods. Well, actually, changes in our periods can be one of the earliest indicators of perimenopause. So either getting closer together, further apart, lighter, or heavier. This lovely graph gives you a kind of a picture of what's happening to our two key hormones, so estrogen and progesterone, over our lifetime. So you can see that in our kind of reproductive years, progesterone, which is the darker line, is fluctuating throughout our cycle. So it's high in the second half of our cycle. And the estrogen, which is the pink line, is a lot more stable. And then suddenly we hit perimenopause and you've got this kind of real roller coastering of hormones. So that fluctuation at the same time as both of those hormones are then dropping away. So those extreme fluctuations are responsible for some symptoms like mood swings, for example, and other symptoms are caused by the drop away of our hormones that our bodies have been used to having over the course of our reproductive years. And we've got estrogen receptors all over our bodies and in our brains. So another lovely diagram showing you just how many receptors we do have all over our brains for both estrogen and progesterone. So that declining estrogen impacts things like thermoregulation, our body's ability to keep us in that zone of temperature that they like to be in, hence the hot flashes. Production of things like serotonin, dopamine, and noradrenaline, which are our happy hormones, impacting our mood, anxiety, depression. Production of things like collagen, elastin, and hyaluronic acid, so leading to thinning hair, skin changes, dry skin, making us more prone to things like tendon injuries. It also mediates inflammation levels in our body, and that can lead to things like more joint pain, which is a common symptom a lot of people don't necessarily realize can be linked to menopause. It's also involved in the way that our bones renew themselves. So you may not know, our bones are constantly renewing themselves. So as our estrogen drops, then those rates of bone renewal also reduce, making us more prone to things like osteoporosis and osteopenia, which is the step before osteoporosis. On average, we'll lose around 12% of our bone mineral density during menopause, and then 0.5% every year after that. In our liver, estrogen helps slow down the conversion of nutrients into glucose. So it's reducing the body's glucose production and helping our muscles to take up glucose, mopping up what's free and circulating in the bloodstream. And then progesterone helps our tissues like our muscles and our liver be able to absorb and utilize glucose. So that keeps excess glucose out of circulation. Pre-menopause, women have a lower risk of developing diabetes than men, but then during that transition period, the diabetes risk rises steeply to catch up with and then surpass that of a man the same age. our blood sugar trends up and our insulin sensitivity goes down. We tend to gain weight even though our diet and our exercise routines haven't changed. And on top of that, the estrogen's ability to keep our cholesterol in check starts to diminish. So LDL-C goes up and HDL goes down. So there's more cardiometabolic risk. Estrogen also pushes our brains to burn glucose to make energy. So again, we get things like brain fog, and it buffers the effects of our stress hormone cortisol, which can lead to more anxiety and panicky feelings. Progesterone, maybe not quite so well studied, but certainly we know it's got a big part in helping us get to sleep and stay asleep, and also in anxiety. We also produce testosterone. That usually starts to decline gradually in midlife, but for those going through surgical menopause, the drop-off can be a lot more dramatic, and that can lead to sort of a crash in libido, headaches, fatigue, concentration problems, and low mood. If you're interested in finding out a bit more about what is going on with our brains in menopause, I can highly recommend The Menopause Brain by Dr. Lisa Mosconi. Some of you may have heard her. She's been promoting her book very, very widely over the last couple of months. And also her previous book, The XX Brain, is also very interesting. So around 70% of us will experience neurological symptoms during the menopause transition. So she goes in the book into a lot more detail about what's going on. So I've already talked a little bit about, what estrogen is responsible for, or kind of involved in processes that's involved in our body. And I call it our kind of hero or heroine hormone. And actually we've got 3 forms of estrogen, but the one that we're really interested in here is estradiol, which is the one that is dropping away as our kind of ovaries start to pack up shop. So a few other things that it's doing: it's protecting our heart, it's keeping our blood vessels flexible and our cholesterol low, as I've already mentioned, regulating our metabolism, our fat stores, talked a little bit about bone renewal as well. It's a lubricator, so we might find that we get things like dry eyes. It lubricates our joints. And also, I think I've mentioned, keeps things like inflammation in check. So most of us will have heard of hot flashes. They're the stereotypical symptom that are associated with perimenopause, but actually not all of us get hot flashes. It's around 85%. So just because somebody does not experiencing hot flashes, it doesn't mean that they're not in perimenopause. Obviously, hot flashes can occur at nighttime, so we call those night sweats. Those can be really, really debilitating for somebody who could be experiencing those multiple times during the course of the night. Sometimes people even having to sort of change their night clothes, their sheets on their bed, that kind of thing. Irritability, that mood swings, that rage that really comes out of nowhere. Again, I think probably quite a lot of people are familiar with that, but I think if you're in those sort of earlier stages of perimenopause and you're not necessarily thinking that it could be related, sometimes that can be quite scary when they come out of nowhere. Insomnia, another very common symptom that may or may not be linked to those lovely night sweats, and loss of libido. And then quite a few sort of lesser known symptoms that might surprise you. So I mentioned briefly anxiety, very, very common, especially in the earlier stages of perimenopause. And people who've never experienced anxiety before might suddenly start, and those who have struggled with it in the past may find it comes back more intensely. That might manifest itself as sort of social anxiety or anxiety driving, are 2 very common versions. Heart palpitations, also very common, again, can be distressing if you don't know what's going on, can lead to, sort of medical interventions or kind of testing that isn't necessarily needed. Obviously, we would always suggest getting that checked out if you're experiencing heart palpitations, but again, not a lot of physicians will know that that's a potential menopause symptom. And then weird and wonderful things like change in taste and smell. You remember, again, we've got these estrogen receptors all over our brains and in our bodies. And then things like increased in urinary tract infections. So the walls down there are potentially thinning, more likely to get an infection, because of a break in the urethral walls, for example. Some people finding they're getting repeated UTIs and they don't know why. That could be a reason. Things like increase in noise sensitivity, so which has the lovely name of misphonia, and is one that I particularly have suffered with over the last few years. You may find that you're increasingly intolerant to the noise of somebody chewing in close proximity to you. Increase in allergies because of histamine changes in the body, and things like crawling sensation on the skin and itching or dry skin. Here you've got the kind of the whole shopping list, depending on the source you refer to. There are said to be anywhere between sort of 34 and 48 recognized symptoms. You're very unlikely, you'd be very unlucky to get every single one of those. But I think it's worth remembering as well that some of those tend to come and go. So they might only be experienced for a short while. They might be linked, they might be cyclical, so come and go over the course of a cycle. One of the things that we haven't necessarily talked much about is something with the fabulous name of genitourinary symptom of menopause. And that encompasses things like vaginal dryness, pain with sex, bladder weakness, prolapse. And around 80% of people will experience those symptoms, but they're potentially the ones that people are least likely to ask for help with due to kind of embarrassment. We'll come back to, when we're talking about hormone therapy, we'll talk about localized estrogen, which is very safe and very effective in treating that, if that's something that somebody is struggling with. So yeah, please don't be alarmed. Not everyone is going to get this whole shopping list of symptoms, and broadly, we talk about, 1 in 4 experiencing, very, very mild or possibly even no symptoms at all. Another 1 in 4, so another sort of 25% experiencing kind of symptoms that are more the debilitating end of the spectrum. And then kind of the rest, the other 50% somewhere in the middle, so experiencing a kind of a combination of maybe 5 or 6 or 7 different symptoms. And again, those might come and go over time. So yeah, let's move on to talk a little bit about hormone therapy. Now, obviously, I'm a lot more familiar with what we do here in the UK than in the US. I think there's a lot more variability there in terms of what you might be able to get access to. So why go for menopause hormone therapy? Well, over here in the UK, we quite often refer to that as hormone replacement therapy. And that's perhaps a little bit misleading, because we're not actually giving people hormones to replace up to the high level of hormones that they would have had, say, in their 20s, potentially. We're just topping up levels slightly to help with managing symptoms. Many of the misconceptions and concerns around menopause hormone therapy that are still around today stem from something called the Women's Health Initiative study from 2002. You may or may not have heard of that. But essentially, that was a huge study that was stopped early due to indications and sort of misreporting, really, of indications of increased risk of particularly breast cancer, but also cardiovascular disease. And as a result of that, the numbers of people taking hormone therapy dropped dramatically. Before 2002, the uptake was around 44% in the US. I believe it is now down at around 5%. So a lot of those negative associations with that particular study still persist to this day, and lots of OBGYNs don't have mandatory training on menopause. And unfortunately, then many of your healthcare professionals are, don't understand menopause. They don't understand hormone therapy, the risks and the benefits, and people struggle to get access to the care that they need. It's worth saying, then unpacking just a little bit about that WHI study. So a lot of the problems with that were kind of debunked over the last sort of 2 decades. The women in the study had a higher than average BMI and an average age of 63, making them 10 years post-menopause. So we know now that those who start hormone therapy closer to menopause, so in that 10 years post-menopause, actually have reduced risk in the main of cardiovascular disease. Most of them were also using the older style hormone therapy, not the new body identical hormone therapy, which is much, much safer. So type of hormone therapy will depend on whether somebody is still having periods, whether regular or irregular, and whether they still have their uterus or whether they might have had that surgically removed for whatever reason. Modern hormone therapy is plant-based and it's body identical. So in most cases, it is either the same as what your body is manufacturing or as close as. So if they've have no womb, if they've had a hysterectomy, somebody is able to have estrogen only hormone therapy. But if they do still have their womb, then it's really, really important that they get a progestin alongside that estrogen to protect against thickening of the womb lining and endometrial cancer. And then the way that they take that will depend again on whether they're still having periods or whether they're sort of post-menopausal and have stopped. So we talk about a kind of the safety profile, so transdermal estrogen through the skin, whether that's in a patch, a gel, or a spray, is much, much safer than the old style estrogen tablets that would have to be metabolized by the liver. And then micronized progesterone is the form that is most identical to the form produced by our bodies. And there's no increased risk of breast cancer if that's taken for less than 5 years. And then over 5 years, then that's again a conversation to have with your healthcare provider. But generally, the risks are very low. And I think I'm not sure if I've got a slide on that in here, but hopefully, if people want to have questions about that, we can take it at the end. So yeah, for people who do decide to go on to hormone therapy, it can sometimes take time to get the kind of the dosage right to alleviate those symptoms. Some people may not absorb it particularly well through a particular method, so they might need to change from a patch to a gel or vice versa. And some people have something called progesterone intolerance, so they actually might get on better with a synthetic progestin. And it doesn't necessarily work for everyone. So some people you might hear or speak to who have gone onto this and it's totally transformed their lives. I've heard people say, I felt, better within days or weeks. And other people just find it doesn't work for them. So it's not a silver bullet. You can, whether you're on systemic, so whole body hormone therapy or not, you can still have localized transdermal through the skin estrogen in the vaginal vulval area. It's very, very safe, very low risk, and so it can be taken alongside systemic hormone therapy or on its own. So 1 day's dose of systemic hormone therapy estrogen is equal to a whole year's worth of local estrogen. It's such low dose, it's only absorbed locally through the tissues, it's not metabolized by the liver. And there is research showing that even sort of most people with hormone sensitive breast cancer can still be given vaginal estrogen. Some of the other benefits then, apart from alleviating symptoms, if people are struggling with them, protective against osteoporosis. So we've already talked about those kind of risks of bone density declining over the years. 1 in 3, or certainly that's the stat over here, 1 in 3 women will develop osteoporosis. And a woman who breaks their hip in their 70s has a higher risk of dying within 1 year than they would from most cancers. It's also protective against colorectal cancer, and most research suggests that it's protective against cardiovascular disease, which is the biggest cause of death for women post 55. There's a lot of research going on around whether estrogen or hormone therapy is protective against dementia. Nothing conclusive at the moment, but some very interesting research ongoing. And then this, I'm not sure how well you can see it, but this is a really interesting graph that shows that sort of drop away in terms of numbers of people taking hormone therapy. So dropped, I think, by around 2/3 in that year post the WHI study. Antidepressants almost doubled from 2002 to 2015. And sleep medication, again, doubling between 2005 and 2023. Those are numbers from the US. So I think that's quite telling in terms of, we're really just swapping one form of medication for another that in and of itself isn't necessarily without problems. So yeah, I have put something in here. This comes from a UK source at Women's Health Concern in terms of breast cancer risk. So estrogen only hormone therapy is associated with little or no change in risk of breast cancer, but where it's combined with a progestin can be associated with a small increased risk when it's used for more than 5 years. Keeping that in perspective, that additional risk is actually less than if that same person would drink 2 or more units of alcohol a day, and much less than the risks associated with being overweight or obese. And then the risk actually comes down again for people who are doing sort of 2.5 hours moderate exercise per week. But obviously not everybody can take hormone therapy, wants to take hormone therapy, or finds that it works for them. So what are the other things that we have available in our symptom management toolkit? So we'll talk on the next slide about lifestyle changes. In terms of herbal therapies, this has been a really exploding area. Sort of supplements specifically targeted at menopause is big business. Obviously, it's very difficult to do clinical standard trials of these things. And so evidence and research for kind of things is pretty limited. You will always be able to find somebody who says, I took XYZ, you know, ashwagandha, red clover, whatever, and it helped me. But again, you know, there's limited evidence that black cohosh and St. John's wort are both helpful, but in some people, you know, that there might be contraindications, for example. So, you know, we always advise people to be extremely careful if they're taking herbal therapies and talk to their doctor. In terms of the things that we do know are helpful to take, we call about the kind of the key 3. So magnesium, which I'll talk a little bit more about on the next slide, but is involved in over 300 processes in our bodies, and probably around 48% of us are deficient in magnesium. We're not getting enough in our diet. Can be really supportive for sleep in particular, sort of muscle issues and joint issues and gut health and mood. Vitamin D, we know that we should be taking that. Again, many of us are deficient in that, and that can be really helpful, particularly for bone health. And then omega-3 for brain health can also be helpful for hot flashes and anxiety and depression. Cognitive behavioral therapy has been shown to be kind of supported for hot flashes and definitely for people struggling with insomnia. So something called CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, has been shown to be extremely effective. Doing something like yoga, helpful for kind of joints, bone health, flexibility, as well as the mental well-being. I don't know if you necessarily have it in the US, but certainly here in the UK, we've got a lot of yoga practitioners who are trained in menopause yoga, that's sort of targeted at slightly different combinations of yoga depending on where somebody is in their menopause transition. And then there are non-hormonal medications that can be prescribed for those who can't take hormone therapy, for example, or decide not to, or try and find it's not helpful. So low doses of paroxetine can be helpful to reduce frequency and severity of hot flashes and night sweats and improve sleep. And then citalopram, venlafaxine, and desvenlafaxine for also shown efficacy in those areas. So desvenlafaxine reducing hot flashes by around 62% and lessening severity by 25%. So there are various options available there. And now we've got new drugs on the horizon. So Veoza, I think, was FDA approved last year. It's now, we're looking to have it approved here in the UK for on the National Health Service. And that targets a particular protein in the brain, so neurokinin B, that binds to a particular receptor in the hypothalamus. This is the region of the brain that regulates body temperature. So again, it doesn't necessarily work for everybody, but it's another option for somebody that might be struggling with hot flashes. And then when we talk in our webinars about lifestyle changes, we created something called the SENSE model. And that kind of talks about the sort of these 5 different pillars that levers that we can pull, changes that we can make to help us get through kind of perimenopause in good shape, and then kind of live in that sort of second phase of life, in that post-menopausal phase, and have sort of much better health span. So sleep is one of the key ones. Sleep disturbance can be a significant issue, as we've already mentioned. Lack of sleep can also increase our hunger hormone, that's called ghrelin, and decrease leptin, which is our fullness hormone. So if we're having difficulty sleeping, that can have knock-on effects in terms of increased appetite, cravings for sugar, for caffeine. Looking at alcohol, so for example, that can be a real driver of sort of early morning wake-ups. Caffeine, avoiding things like cutting out things like caffeine after midday, just to sort of help support sleep. And I've already mentioned CBTI. And if you're interested, there's a whole podcast episode that I did with a sleep specialist. So we go into this in a lot more detail. Exercise is the next one. So we've already talked about the fact that 2.5 hours of activity a week can reduce our risks of breast cancer, but it also reduces our risk of Alzheimer's, type 2 diabetes, high blood pressure, and even depression. Essentially, if we could have it in pill form, we'd all be taking it. It's really, really important. We've already talked a little bit about the decline in our sort of bone strength through that menopause transition, but our muscle mass also declines. So we call that sarcopenia. We want to redress that by starting in midlife, if we haven't already, to do that weight-bearing exercise to sort of help build muscle mass and help build bone strength. So sort of strength training, weight training, strength and resistance training, all of those things, really, really important as our estrogen levels drop away. But then exercise for stress relief, for cardiovascular health as well. So trying to get a mix in there of that cardio, strength, flexibility, and maybe some restorative exercise like yoga that we've already talked about. But obviously, we need to be realistic with what we can achieve. There are only so many hours in the day. So I think if you're if you're looking to start, don't sort of, be realistic with what you're going, where you can start, and kind of working up from there. Nutrition wise, protein, really, really important for that muscle building that we've already talked about. This is an area that we really need to focus on in midlife. And if we're not getting enough calories from our what we're eating day to day, then actually our bodies will prioritize using protein for energy and not for muscle building. So again, if we're not getting a kind of a balanced intake over a day, over a week, and we're not getting enough protein, that's going to get sort of used up as our bodies kind of use that as an efficient source of fuel. In terms of fiber, the target we should be aiming for is around 30 grams a day, but most of us get about half of that. It can really, really help to keeping us full, so stopping us from again sort of having cravings, and very sort of supportive for our gut health. Talked a little bit about nutrients like magnesium, other things like iron deficiency, zinc deficiency, and B vitamin deficiencies can very often overlap with or exacerbate some of those menopause symptoms. So, potentially worth sort of supplementing if we think that we are not getting sufficient of that in our diet. And then thinking about things like our blood sugar. So trying to avoid sort of blood sugar peaks and troughs, which can really have an impact on our mood, for example. But also we've got that increased propensity as our estrogen levels are dropping towards insulin resistance. And if we, if we have too much sugar circulating, then that can also exacerbate those tendencies. Cutting back on alcohol, already talked about that, but that can be a trigger for hot flushes. hot flashes, sorry. And for a lot of people, alcohol actually really exacerbates anxiety. So if that is an issue for somebody in perimenopause, then really cutting way back on alcohol can be very supportive. I think we already talked a little bit about, again, looking at caffeine. If you're struggling with sleep, that can also be a trigger for hot flashes for a lot of people. Staying hydrated, it's really simple, but so important. If you feel thirsty, you're already dehydrated. And our thirst cues actually diminish as we age. So we take in less water anyway, unless we're really being kind of proactive and on it. And that dehydration can have a real impact on brain fog, on our joints, on kind of, how creaky our joints feel, on our energy levels, on headaches, which quite often people find they'll have increased in headaches and migraines in menopause. And then stress is a real big one. So obviously we can't eliminate stress completely from our lives. But those elevated levels of cortisol, if we've got chronic levels of stress, can really exacerbate our symptoms, elevate inflammation. Also, again, kind of encouraging that insulin resistance and depositing visceral fat around our middle, which is increasing our risk again for cardiovascular disease. And then it also downregulates things like digestion, sleep, and our production of estrogen. It's also, chronic stress is also a known risk factor for Alzheimer's disease. So definitely, worth trying to think about, what can we do to manage and mitigate our stress? How can we, find ways to deal with that, whether it's making changes to kind of work, home life, doing more exercise to try and offset some of that, restorative exercise potentially. And then environment is the last one that kind of underpins those 4 other areas, but can have a huge capacity on a huge impact on our capacity to make those positive changes. So, what's your work environment like? Is it supportive? Is it energizing, or is it really stressful? Often in midlife, it's a point where we're reevaluating our place in the world. What are we here for? We're halfway through. What are we doing? We might be thinking about retraining, pivoting. What are our relationships like? Are they supportive? It's a peak time for a relationship breakdown. Maybe empty nesting is happening, or certainly some research done here in the UK the year before last looked at divorce rates, and specifically where people cited menopause, difficulties around menopause really, really impacting on relationships. So around people attributing that to around 70% of relationship breakdowns. And then something called, that midlife collision, those sort of caring upward and downward responsibilities that may all come together at the same time as menopause symptoms come into play. Often we are at the very bottom of the to-do list. Everyone else kind of gets in there first, and if whatever is kind of left for us to time left over for us, we feel guilty about prioritizing us and our needs. But this is a real time where we need to start putting ourselves at the top of the to-do list. So why talk about this in a workplace context? Well, many of us going into this life phase do so as we reach more senior roles in our career. Again, research out of the UK showed that around 1 in 10 of those going through the transition left work as a direct result, and 1 in 4 were considering leaving their current role. So that can have a really significant impact on things like gender diversity at senior levels in an organization, never mind on sort of, family finances or family dynamics. So more and more organizations, both here in the UK and in the US, are realizing that supporting their colleagues through this transition makes good business sense. And it's one strand in a strategy to sort of fix that leaky pipeline and get more women into senior leadership positions. As I've already mentioned, this can hit just as we're hitting that peak juggling mode: children, teenagers, elderly parents, divorce, bereavement, maybe other health issues at play. So there's a lot going on. And also, there is a huge amount of taboo around the topic. Things are changing, but I think, I know certainly from the conversations that I've had with Kayleen around this, still in the US, there's a lot of stigma and taboo attached to the topic. So I see things changing, and I'm very hopeful that these conversations will be normalized in the future. But if you're in an organization that hasn't started talking about this, it can be difficult to be the first one that might be open and vocal about it. So the slide that you've got there looks at a report that came out late last year from the Chartered Institute of Personnel and Development. So kind of top 3 things that people were struggling with in the workplace around sort of concentration, stress, and being less patient with colleagues or clients. And that's very much reflected. This is a US survey also from last year. So a lot of overlap there. What's impacting on people's productivity and performance? Problems concentrating, brain fog, headaches and migraine, fatigue and low energy, issues with sleep, joint pain, forgetfulness. So here in the UK, we've got legislation that means that employers have a duty of care and need to make reasonable adjustments. I don't think you have an equivalent there in the US. But if you have a sort of sympathetic employer or a sympathetic manager, then some of the things that can be helpful, depending on what symptoms are happening, are sort of flexibility around working patterns or task allocations, or even where you work. How flexible are they? Can you request flexibility at short notice if you have flooding, so bleeding through clothes, or insomnia, and you've only had a couple of hours of sleep? Are you able to sort of start your working day a bit later and accommodate for that? And then in terms of the work environment, are you able to adjust the temperature? Are you able to move to different part of the building if you need to for that, or for light, or for noise? Some people really struggle with a noisy environment. Or can you have noise cancelling headphones? Do you have access to a fan? If you have to wear a uniform, are you able to get extra sets of uniform? If you have to wear protective equipment, safety equipment, is that fit for purpose? Are you able to have breaks from that if you need to, if you're struggling, and potentially additional rest breaks, if you're dealing with symptoms? And then simple things like access to cold drinking water, changing facilities to be able to kind of change clothing, to be able to wash potentially or shower if that's needed, emergency period products, because periods can be very unpredictable, or potentially kind of quiet spaces where, if somebody just needs a bit of time out, or to be able to kind of go and work in a quieter area of a building, for example. So those are the kinds of things that can be really helpful and make a huge difference in terms of, if somebody is struggling. If you need or want to kind of open up that conversation with your manager, here are just a few of the pointers that we suggest. So make some notes before time. Make sure that you're able to kind of explain and show what your symptoms are, how they're impacting you in the workplace. If you're happy to disclose all of that, what have you already tried? What are you thinking of trying to help mitigate those symptoms? What do you feel would be helpful in your workplace? And making sure that you're having that kind of one-to-one meeting, somewhere that you're not going to be disturbed or overheard, and you'll have enough time, because sometimes these conversations can be really quite difficult. And making sure that that your manager understands that potentially there would be a need for regular check-ins, because things do change and fluctuate over time. So if you are interested in finding out more, we've got free resources available on the website. So there are free resources for individuals, including Symptom Checker. There are free resources for organizations, including an audit checklist. So if your company is thinking about becoming more menopause friendly, menopause aware, there are some good pointers in there. And then, as I mentioned, my podcast is at middlingalong.com. You'll find a whole range of experts and different topics that hopefully you can find whatever you're looking for. But some other great US-based podcasts. There's one called You Are Not Broken, and another one called Press Play, Not Pause. So menopause.org/for women is the website of the North American Menopause Society. If you want to look for a menopause practitioner, then you're able to do that and do a search by your region. Kayleen, I think mentioned the Balanced Menopause site, which has an extensive library of resources available on there. Some of you may have heard of somebody called Tamsin Fadal, who I believe was a news anchor, who's now one of the very, very vocal kind of menopause campaigners there in the US. And the Daisy Network is a charity based here in the UK which supports individuals going through premature ovarian insufficiency. I haven't had a chance to look and see if you have an equivalent over there in the US, but I think some of the resources that they make available potentially would still be helpful and supportive. So I realised that I've really kind of rattled through that. Hopefully we've got enough time before people need to disappear for questions. But you can find me obviously at the website, or you can email me, emma@managingthemenopause.com. So I'm going to stop sharing. And I think we've got
Thank you. I think I probably speak for all of us going, oh my gosh.
But we want to be prepared, not scared. Like the last thing I want to do is to frighten anybody who's kind of not in this phase of life yet, and they're thinking,
I think that's what's so important about this conversation, is that we don't talk about it. So we're not prepared for it. So we suffer in silence, suffer alone, and then maybe not. We have a physician that recognizes what's happening. So there are a couple questions here, and if y'all need to jump off, please feel free to do so, but I'll just field these for you, Emma. So the first one is, does being on any sort of hormonal birth control affect when one starts perimenopause? For example, fairly regular cycle has a hormonal IUD, but exhibiting signs of perimenopause confirmed by physicians. Does the hormonal IUD affect this timing?
Yeah, so if something called the Mirena coil, which has a progestin, synthetic progestin in, can obviously kind of gives back some of that progestin. So that can mask some of the symptoms, but obviously it's not going to have any kind of impact on the estrogen levels. So Mirena and sort of a hormone IUD can actually be used as part of the hormone therapy, the progestin component of HRT, if someone is taking hormone therapy. But yeah, I mean, essentially, it wouldn't stop somebody from having symptoms. So definitely, you know, if they're having some of those symptoms, it's worth going to have a conversation. But realizing that if they have a hormonal IUD, they would be able to keep that as part of their hormone therapy, and then take estrogen alongside that. And obviously, you know, if we are still having periods, we still do need protection against unplanned pregnancies, even though those kind of periods might be irregular. And I believe the recommendation is to kind of keep that up until the age of 55. I'd have to double check that.
That is actually my path. I do have a Mirena IUD, and I can say, even though I'm on 3 different HRT strategies, I don't have to worry in large part because of that IUD, which I was happy to hear. Next one, a guest has a blood clotting tendency called factor V. Do you know if the newer HRT therapies have low risk for people with that by any chance? The physician is saying absolutely no hormone ever for this person. Ideas?
I'm not a physician. I know that the transdermal forms of estrogen have, you know, very, very little to no blood clotting risk. So it depends on the type, but I don't know enough about factor V to be able to say that. You know, I know that the risk for the transdermal estrogen is completely different to the risk profile for oral pill form estrogen, for example.
Okay, so it could be old info then working.
I will try and find out and come back to you. So I'm gonna make a note, and then I can get back to you. via you, Kayleen, if that's.
Yeah.
And in fact, if you're able to copy and paste that across to me in an email, then I'll
Sure.
try and.
Yeah, I will do that. Here's another question. Partial hysterectomy at 38. Hormone testing shows they're in full menopause. Do you think a partial hysterectomy can raise the risk of early menopause?
It can do, because it will, even if the ovaries haven't been removed, then the hysterectomy can impact on blood supply to the ovaries, so they are more prone to kind of shutting down earlier than they might have done otherwise. Yeah.
Okay. Would you typically speak to primary care physician about hormone therapy, or would you prefer a specific gynecologist or a menopause specialist?
I think it's highly dependent on your healthcare provider and whether they have, gone out and sought training on this, because even a lot of gynecologists will find that they don't have the most up-to-date training, or any necessarily training on this, unfortunately. So yeah, I think if certainly, it's worth starting with your primary care physician. But I think if if they're not helpful, then I would look at the NAMS website that I shared and have a look for a specialist, someone who is kind of approved and trained in this particular topic, if you're able to access that. I appreciate, it's a very different system there.
I know. So I can speak to my own journey with this. I finally found a menopause specialist here, and if anyone wants her contact, I'm in Portland, Oregon. I'm happy to give her info out. She's fantastic. My primary care physician couldn't even find the stuff that she has prescribed for me. Like, she has a compounded solution for me that is a cream, couldn't even find it in his database. He just had to make notes. So like, there is a really big disparity going on in our healthcare system in terms of helping women in general, but specifically this topic as well. So I would recommend myself in the States finding someone that knows what they're talking about. Here's another one. My mother and I believe she's currently in perimenopause and have several reasons. We have several reasons, but a major one is increase in at times debilitating vertigo as a result of anxiety and possibly increased blood pressure. Is that possible to have
Yeah,
it
I
as a
think a
symptom?
lot of people do experience kind of dizziness, vertigo, increased clumsiness, that kind of thing. So yeah, it can be a symptom of menopause.
I see Keisha has her hand up. That's the next one.
Thank you. I have a quick question about how menopause, how do you have that conversation with your manager, about that? Because I saw that in the presentation, but it seems like a very awkward position to be in, to go before your management and have that conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I guess a lot depends on, what your kind of interpersonal dynamic is with that kind of individual in the first place, what the kind of the company culture is like, what kind of, whether they have sort of supportive policies of any kind in place. So yeah, it's really hard to be prescriptive. But I think, as with anything where you're having a conversation with your manager, we talk about not kind of necessarily bringing problems, but bringing solutions. So depending on what's going on for you, if you're struggling with a particular thing, going into that meeting and saying, I would find it really supportive if I could do this. So I don't know, like, if you're struggling with sleep issues, I would find it really supportive if on the days that I have a really, really dreadful night's sleep, that it would be okay for me to work from home, or to start work a little bit later, or whatever it is that you have put some kind of preparation and thought into, what's going on for you, and kind of giving them a steer in terms of what would be helpful, what would be supportive. And obviously that's going to vary depending on what's going on for you. Is that helpful?
Oh, that was very helpful. Thank you.
Tough conversations. Here's one. I have PCOS, treated surgically for excessive bleeding and an ablation and a tubectomy at 40, should I still be looking at hormone therapy?
I don't think I can answer that one, unfortunately.
I say yes to all. Just look into it. I will say I have learned through my journey that there's really like no testing shows us exactly where we are. And then suddenly the testing is like, okay, you're done. So like I've asked my physician, why can't we just have like a test like you do for diabetes? Like it's really all over the place today. You figure out, oh, I need a little bit more, whatever. But it changes literally like that graph that you showed us, Emma, where
From
it's
hour to hour, potentially.
from hour
you could
to
test
hour.
and they would be like, yeah, your hormone
Yeah.
levels are fine. And then the next day they're on the floor or they're up here. So
Yeah. So
the
yeah,
difficulty.
it really is. I wish there was better ways to understand where we're at in it. Let's see. I think I grabbed most of the questions. If not, feel free to raise your hand or unmute. I think I got them. It's such a big topic, and I'm so thankful that you had so much data for us to really absorb and take a look at. And I think we all probably have more questions than anything, at least, you know, to question our physicians and and be okay within ourselves saying, I wonder if this is what it is I'm experiencing, rather than I'm just pissed off at every single thing in the whole world ever. And maybe there's something else happening. Maybe there's something else going on. So, all right. Well, with that, if there's nothing further, that wraps up our time. And have a wonderful afternoon. Oh, yes, Eileen was wondering if we could have that last slide. My bad, Eileen, that had all those information. And I could, or I can share with folks too, if that's helpful.
Yeah, shall I send you a follow-up with all of the links in, so that
That
if
would
people
be
want to
awesome.
look for that additional information or be in touch with me? Obviously, you know, if the companies that you work at are interested in, you know, raising awareness and educating workforces, because it's going to impact all of us, whether directly or indirectly,
Right.
through kind of partners or team members or, you know, just friends, family, whatever.
Right. Excellent. Okay, I will get that and send it to everyone. So, all right.
Well,
Thank you.
thank you so much
Have
for
a
having me.
wonderful afternoon. See you all later.
Bye-bye.
Thanks so much.